They had already cut the chain to length before she understood what the length was for. Maren felt the cold weight of it settle around her throat as two of Theron's men forced her down onto the flat black stone at the edge of Ashfell territory. The Sundering Stone. She had stood at the back of this clearing 100 times for 100 other ceremonies. Namings, joinings, the marking of pups who got their wolves at 13 the way she never had. She had always stood at the back. Tonight they had dragged her to the front, and the whole pack stood behind her in a half-moon of torchlight, and not one of them met her eyes. The chain was silver. She knew it the moment it touched her skin, because silver was the one thing on this earth her body recognized like an old enemy. It burned cold. It made her teeth ache, and her thoughts go thin. They had threaded silver links through her wrists and her throat, so that even the thing inside her that had never once woken in 22 years would stay asleep on the long walk into the dark. Alpha Theron stepped into the torchlight. He was broad through the shoulders, gray coming in at his temples, and he wore the easy weight of a man who had never in his life been told no. He looked at her the way a farmer looks at a field he has finally decided to burn. "Maren of no line," he said, loud enough for the back rows. "Omega. Silent-born. You carry no wolf and no worth, and the pack has fed you 22 winters out of mercy. Mercy." She tasted the word and found it rotten. "The rogue lands grow hungry," Theron went on. "The beasts beyond our border take our cattle and our scouts. The old ways demand a tribute. Tonight Ashfell gives what it can spare." What it can spare. There it was. Not a sacrifice. A discard, dressed up as one. She searched the crowd anyway. She couldn't help it. The body learns to beg before the mind agrees to. She found her half-sister near the front, where the favored one stood. Vela. Same dark hair, same sharp jaw, the face Maren might have worn if she'd been born to the right mother. Vela was looking at the stone between Maren's knees, at the chain, at anything that was not Maren's face. Her hands were closed so tight the knuckles had gone white. "Look at me," Maren said. Her voice came out cracked. "Vela, look at me." Vela looked, for one breath, and in that breath, Maren saw something she had no name for. Not pity, not quite guilt, something with sharper edges than either, before Theron's daughter turned her head away. Then the men hauled Maren up by the chain and walked her past the boundary cairn into the dark, and the torches stayed behind, and the singing started, and the singing was for the pack's protection, not for her, and somewhere under all of it she heard her own pulse going far too fast. They left her at the foot of a dead hill and did not look back. The rogue lands began the way a held breath begins, all at once and without ceremony. One step past the cairn, the grass died under her boots. The trees here had grown wrong, black-barked and bent, their branches reaching down instead of up like hands that had given up on the sky. Fog moved low along the ground in slow gray rivers. Above her the moon hung swollen and white behind torn cloud, and the light it threw was the color of bone. Maren walked because standing still felt like an invitation. The silver had loosened slightly. They'd left only the throat chain on her, a leash with no hand holding it, and as the burn faded, a strange awareness crept up through her bare arms, the hair lifting, the skin going tight, some old animal sense she had never been allowed to trust, telling her very quietly that she was not alone. She heard them before she saw them, not footsteps, breathing, low and patient, and coming from more directions than one creature could occupy. She turned, and the fog gave them up two at a time, wolves, but not the size of any wolf she had ever seen, shoulders as high as her ribs, eyes throwing back the moon in flat gold coins. 4, 6, more behind them she could only feel. They had formed a ring around her without a sound, and now they simply watched, heads low, and made no move to close. This was the part where she was supposed to die. She had made her peace with that on the walk. She'd decided, somewhere past the second hill, that she would not scream and she would not run, because she had spent her whole life being told she was nothing, and she would be damned if she'd spend her last minute proving it. So she stood inside the ring of teeth with the silver cold at her throat, and she lifted her chin, and she waited. The wolves parted. They didn't scatter. They split, deliberate as a door opening, and through the gap came a man. He walked out of the fog like the fog had decided to keep some of itself in human shape. Tall, dark-haired, a heavy fur and leather cloak across one shoulder, and old steel at the other, a short dark beard. He moved without hurry, and the wolves leaned toward him as he passed the way grass leans toward water. He stopped an arm's length from her, close enough that she could see his eyes were not gold like theirs, but a pale gray that the moon made almost silver, and he looked at her face, then at the chain, then at her face again, with an expression that made no sense at all on the face of a thing that should have been eating her. He looked like a man who had been waiting at a window for a very long time and had finally seen the road move. "You took your time," he said quietly. His voice was low, rough at the edges. 22 years. I'd begun to think they'd buried you." Maren's mouth had gone dry. "I don't know you." "No." Something flickered across his face. Not anger. Grief, maybe, worn smooth by repetition. They made very sure of that. His gaze dropped again to the silver at her throat, and now there was nothing smooth about it. "Who put this on you?" "The pack. Ashfell. I'm the—" She stopped. The word she'd worn her whole life suddenly felt like a lie someone else had written on her. "I'm a tribute," she said instead. "An omega. I have no wolf." The man went very still, and then he laughed. Short, low, no humor in it, the laugh of someone who has just understood the exact shape of a cruelty. "No wolf," he repeated. He reached out, slow, telegraphing every inch of it, and let one finger hover just shy of the chain without touching it. The metal hummed faintly, as if it knew him. "They didn't take your wolf, little fire. They drowned it. In silver, from the cradle." His silver eyes came back up to hers. "And then they sent you to me as garbage, and called it tribute, and they have no idea, what they just walked to my door." "Who are you?" she whispered. The wolves around them lowered their heads, every one, in a single motion, like a field bowing under wind. "My name is Kale," he said. "These are my lands, and you, Maren of no line," his mouth turned, not quite a smile, something older and more dangerous than a smile, "are the one thing in 9 kingdoms I was never willing to spare." The hold did not exist, according to everything Maren had ever been told. The Roguelands were supposed to be a ruin, a dead country of monsters and bones where nothing built and nothing lasted, but Kale led her through a fold in the Black Hills, past sentries who melted out of shadow to dip their heads at him, and the land opened onto a stronghold of dark stone-lit gold from within. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere a smith's hammer kept time. Figures moved on the walls and along the lanes, and they were people. Wolves in skin, yes, but people, with washing strung between windows, and children chasing a leather ball down a muddy lane, and the smell of bread coming off a bakehouse like an accusation. This was the wasteland Ashfell prayed against. It was more alive than Ashfell had been in years. The lowland packs needed a story, Kale said, watching her take it in. Easier to fear a wasteland than to admit you exiled everyone who wouldn't bow to your bloodline, and they built something better out here without you. A grizzled warrior was waiting in the keep's hall, arms crossed, and he did not bow. He was older than Kale, scarred across the brow, and the look he gave Maren could have stripped paint. "This is her," he said, not a question. "The chain on her throat is silver, Kale. She walks in here smelling of Ashfell and silver, and you bring her past the gate? Bram." There was warning in it. 12 years I've watched you wait." Bram's voice dropped. 12 years of every full moon, you standing on the north wall like the wind owed you something. If this is another false scent, if she's a knife they've sent dressed as a— "Smell her again," Kale said. Bram did. And Maren watched a hard old man's face do something complicated and reluctant, watched him take a step back, as though the truth had weight and had just been set down in front of him. He looked at her differently after that, not warmly, but the way you look at something that has turned out to be real. They put her in a room with a fire and a basin and a door that locked from her side, not theirs, she checked. An old woman came with clean clothes and a bowl of stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. Senna, she said her name was, and she clucked at the chain like it was a personal insult. Sit, girl, you'll fall down. There, you've the look of a thing that's run all its life and only just noticed its own legs. Senna pressed the warm bowl into Maren's hands. Eat. Whatever they told you you were, you can be it again tomorrow. Tonight you're just hungry. Maren laughed before she could stop it. A small, startled sound, rusty from disuse. That's the kindest threat I've ever been given. Ha. Senna's eyes crinkled. Keep that. The laughing. They couldn't drown that, at least. It was the silver that came off first. Kale came at moonrise with a leather roll of tools and a flask of something that smelled of crushed leaf and bitterness. He knelt in front of her chair, and he did not touch the chain until she nodded, and even then, he worked the clasp with a care that did not match the size of his hands. This will hurt, he said, not the chain. What comes after? 22 years is a long time to hold a door shut. When it opens, everything behind it comes at once. Why do you keep speaking like you know what's inside me? He paused, the clasp half undone. Because I've felt it since I was a boy, he said. A pull, north and east, toward your hills, going dim and bright like a lamp behind a curtain. I didn't have a name for it for years. Then I did, and I rode for Ashfell, and they told me there was no woman of that age in their pack worth the asking. His jaw tightened. They lied to my face and I believed them, because the pull never died, and a thing that's still alive can't be grieved. So I waited. He looked up at her. I waited for you for 12 years, not knowing if you were a dream. You are not a dream. You are a woman they buried in silver because they were afraid of what you'd wake up to be. The clasp gave. What came after was every bit as bad as he'd promised. It came as heat first, a tide of it rolling up from somewhere under her ribs, scalding, alive, furious, and then as pain, as every nerve she owned remembered at once that it had been screaming silently for 2 decades. Maren went down off the chair onto her knees on the stone. Her spine arched, her hands curled into something that was, for one terrifying instant, not entirely a woman's hands. Longer, the nails gone dark, and a sound tore out of her that she had never made before, low and broken, and not human at all. Kale did not pull away. He dropped to the floor with her, and took her ruined hands in his, and held on. There she is, he said, fierce and quiet, his forehead near hers. There she is, I hear you. 12 years and I finally hear you. Don't fight it back down. You'll only have to do this again. Let her up. I've got you. Nobody is going to chain you again. Not while there's breath in me. Do you understand? Let her up. For one moment the wolf surfaced fully behind Maren's eyes, and the firelight caught them, and they threw the light back gold. Then it ebbed, and she was a woman again, shaking, soaked through, gasping on the floor of a stranger's keep, more whole than she had been in her entire life, and more frightened than she had ever been on the walk to the stone. Because dying she had understood. Being thrown away she had understood. It was the only thing anyone had ever taught her. This, being wanted, being waited for, being held on the floor by something that called her little fire like it was a name worth keeping, this she had no defense against at all. So she did the only thing 22 years had trained her to do, though it took her 3 nights to find the nerve. On the north wall, Bram did not sleep. He stood where his king had stood for 12 years of full moons, watching the dark line of the eastern hills, listening to what the night scouts brought up the stair, their faces tighter each time. Ashfell was moving, not a war party, the whole pack, gathering at the border stones, more wolves than Bram had counted in a decade. He'd distrusted the silver-smelling girl from the moment she crossed the gate, and he distrusted her still. But a bond was a bond, and his king's was real, and that made her his to defend whether he liked it or not. He spat over the parapet and went to wake the warriors. If Ashfell wanted to finish what they'd started, they would find the roguelands awake. On the 3rd night, while the hold slept and the smiths banked their fires, Maren got up and left. Vela found out, days after the casting, that the Lycan King had not killed her sister. She found out the way bad news always travels in a pack, through a scout's white face, through her father's study door slamming, through the word war spoken in the low voices that meant the children should be sent inside. She stood in the corridor outside Theron's study with her back to the cold stone, and listened to her father tell his captains that the king of the Roguelands was massing wolves on the border, that he was claiming Ashfell had stolen and chained and exiled his fated mate, that he was coming to take her back and burn an answer into the hills on his way. "She has no wolf," one of the captains said. "She's an Omega. You said so yourself, you." "She was never an Omega." Theron's voice, flat, final. "I had Senna's mother bind her at the breast, silver in the milk. The seer warned me the year she was born, that Ashfell's bloodline would end the day the king's mate came of age within these walls." A long pause. "So I made sure she'd never come of age. I made her nothing, and then I gave the nothing away." Another pause, and when he spoke again, there was the first thread of fear in it. "I did not think he would want it." In the corridor, Vela closed her eyes. She had spent her whole life being the one who was kept, the chosen daughter, the heir. She had watched her sister eat at the foot of the table and sleep by the kennels, and she had told herself it was the natural order, that Maren was simply less, that the gods had made it so. And it had been a lie. Her father had made it so, with his own hands, in a cradle, and Vela had eaten 22 years of his approval, built on the back of it. She did not go to her father. She went to the stable, and she saddled the fastest horse in it, and she rode east into the dark, not knowing yet whether she meant to warn the king or beg her sister's forgiveness, only knowing that for the first time in her life she was choosing the road herself. Maren got as far as the dead hill before the moon caught her, and the war caught her, and everything she had run from arrived at once. She had meant to vanish into the Roguelands alone, to be no one's mate, and no one's tribute, and no one's anything, which was the only freedom she had ever been able to imagine. But she crested the black hill at moonrise and stopped, because the valley below her was full of wolves, and they were facing each other across the dead ground in two long lines, and she understood with a lurch that the war was already here, and it was already about her. On the near side, Cale's wolves, and Cale himself at their center, half-shifted, vast and dark, more terrible and more beautiful than anything legend had bothered to invent. On the far side, pouring down out of the Ashfell hills, the pack that had raised her on scraps and silver, Theron at their head, and 100 wolves behind him, who had stood in the torchlight only nights ago and watched her dragged to the stone. They had come not to take her back. She saw that clearly. They had come to erase the evidence, to kill the king's mate before the bond could be claimed, so that Ashfell could swear she had simply died in the wild, like every tribute before her. And there, at the bottom of the hill, alone between the two armies on a blown and stumbling horse, was Vela, shouting something the wind tore away. Shouting it at both sides. Theron's wolves were closing on her. Maren did not decide to move. The wolf decided. 22 years drowned and 1 night awake, and it surged up through her on the hilltop without permission or ceremony. The heat, the tearing, the gold flooding her sight. And this time she did not fight it down, and she did not fall. This time she ran into it, down the slope, toward her sister, and somewhere between the top of the hill and the bottom, the woman who had been thrown away as nothing came apart, and reformed as something that shook the air with the force of its arrival. She landed between Vela and Theron's wolves as a wolf herself, pale, vast, gold-eyed, the silver finally and forever out of her blood. And she planted her feet over her sister's fallen horse, and she howled, and the sound of it rolled across the valley and stopped both armies dead. Theron, in the front rank, faltered. She saw it. She saw the exact moment the Alpha who had made her nothing understood that the nothing was standing over his own daughter with the moon on her back, and that the seer had been right after all, and that he had spent 22 years and the whole strength of his pack delivering his own ending to its door. Maren, Vela's voice, behind her, small and wrecked. "I came to warn him. I came to tell. I didn't know. I swear to the moon I didn't know what he'd— I know. She couldn't say it in this shape. She pressed back against her sister once, hard, a wolf's blunt mercy, and felt Vela's hands fist in her fur. Then Kale was there. He came across the dead ground in great dark bounds, and he put himself at her shoulder, the two of them between Theron's 100 and the girl on the ground, and he shifted up into the half-man shape that could speak, and his voice, when it came, was the sound of a mountain deciding to move. Ash fell. It carried to the last rank. You chained a child in silver and called it law. You exiled what you feared and called it mercy. You sent her to me as refuse, and she walked into my lands with her chin up and more honor in her than your whole bloodline has counted in 10 generations. His gold-gray gaze found Theron and held it. She is not your tribute. She is not your shame. She is the Lycan Queen of the Rogue Lands, and she is standing over the daughter you were about to let die. Look at what your daughters became the moment you stopped owning them. Then turn around and take your pack home and pray to whatever you pray to that she is more merciful than you taught her to be. The valley held its breath, and Theron, who had never in his life been told no, who had burned a field rather than fear it, looked at the 2 daughters between him and the king, one in fur and one in the dirt, and something went out of him. Not courage, conviction, the particular hollow that opens in a man when he learns at last that the thing he sacrificed everything to prevent was the only thing that might have loved him. He turned his pack around. They went back into the hills like a tide pulling off a beach, and the dead ground emptied, and the moon came clear of the cloud at last and lit the whole valley silver, the good kind now, the kind that didn't burn. She shifted back near dawn, in the lee of the black hill, wrapped in Kale's cloak with her sister's head in her lap. Vela would heal. She'd ride home eventually, or she wouldn't. That was a road for another season. For now she slept the dead sleep of someone who has finally set something down, and Maren sat with the weight of her and watched the gray come up in the east over the hills that had thrown her away. Kale lowered himself beside her, careful of the sleeping girl. For a while neither of them spoke. "You ran," he said at last. Not an accusation, just the true thing, set down gently between them. "I did." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "I'll probably do it again." "Not far, just," she searched for it. "Being thrown away, I knew how to survive. 22 years of practice. Being kept," her voice caught. "I don't have any practice at being kept. I don't trust it. I'm not sure I know how to learn." He was quiet a moment. Then he reached over, and from the folds of the cloak he drew the silver chain, the throat chain, the one he'd worked off her the night she came, and he laid it across her open palm. The metal was cold, familiar, an old enemy gone toothless. "Then don't trust it," he said. "Not yet. Keep this. Not to wear, to remember that you walked out of it on your own 2 feet before I ever said a word, and that whatever you decide about me, you were never nothing. You were the most dangerous thing in 9 kingdoms. Sleeping, they just couldn't bear to let you wake up." He closed her fingers over the chain. "Wake up slow, little fire. I waited 12 years. I can wait while you learn." She looked down at the silver in her fist, and at her sister breathing in her lap, and at the man who had been standing at a window since before he had a name for her. And she did not feel chosen, exactly, and she did not feel safe, exactly. She felt, for the first time in her life, like the door was on her side of the wall. It would have to be enough to start with. The sun came up over Ashfell's hills, and for once in her life Maren did not turn to see who was watching her from behind.
Somewhere in this story there's a moment you recognized. Not the wolves, not the moon, but the smaller thing underneath it. The particular ache of being kept at the foot of someone's table and taught to call it mercy. Maren carried that chain out of the valley because letting go of what hurt us isn't always the first thing we manage, and that's not a weakness. It's just how long it takes a body to believe it's allowed to take up space. If you've ever stood in a ring of teeth and lifted your chin anyway, sit with that version of yourself for a second before you scroll on. She got you here. And if Maren's first howl gave you that lift in the chest, tell me what woke up in you the moment she stopped running. I read every one of those.